Welcome to another episode of BurnerCast, the only podcast where we talk everything and anything hot air ballooning. Hi again, everybody. I'm your host, Joey Strutz, joined again by my co-hosts, Brad Hosmer, McKenna Seacrest. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing pretty good. Glad to be back. We've had a little break here in our recordings, but we're back at it, hoping to get a few episodes done so we can get it, going into the fall so we can, fly as much as we want to. I know we've all flown recently, hoping to get back in the air this weekend, having a good old time.
I'm doing well, having a chill day, so.
Well, we have an extremely special episode for you tonight. This guy is one of the most well-known people in hot air ballooning. He has a world record 6 U.S. national championships, as well as he won the 1981 World Hot Air Balloon Championships. He is the originator of Cameron Balloons US and holds countless records in ballooning as well. Please welcome to BurnerCast, Bruce Comstock. Hey, Bruce, welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Joey.
It's great to have you on. This has been one of the episodes we've all three been really, really looking forward to, especially since I read your book a few years back now. So the first thing we're going to go into is we'd like to hear about kind of your introduction into ballooning. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was a little slow, actually, but I was very early. I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and we had a little starter house, tiny little starter house on the north side of Ann Arbor. And I was mowing the lawn and a balloon flew by. Now, that sounds like perfectly normal now. But in 1967 or 8 or whenever that was not at all normal. I didn't even know really that hot air balloons existed. And I knew gas balloons had existed like 100 or 150 years before, and it kind of faded away, but that's all I knew about ballooning. So it was really a weird experience, and that seeing it was really exciting to me. I grabbed my wife and jumped in the car, and we chased after it. And the balloon landed about a mile away or so in a weed field. And it was a chair balloon. It was Bill Grab, who later became a friend of ours. But at the time, here's this guy who's dressed with he's got like leather shoes and plaid pants and like a dress shirt on. And he just landed in this little balloon where you sit, in a tiny little seat with an 8-gallon tank on each side. And my wife and I, on the way driving over to see if we could be there when he landed, thought maybe a balloon would cost about $600. And at that time, now Bill's balloon probably cost $3,000. So, I mean, it was way out of reach for someone who was actually a student still at the time. So I had to kind of file it all away. But you have to appreciate the time. There was nothing in the press. There was nothing on television. There was nothing about balloons. It's just like they didn't exist. And here was one, and we saw it, and then maybe I saw a couple more things after that in the following couple of years. But I don't remember. But balloons were almost non-existent. So what really happened then is, well, the first thing I did is I wrote to, sorry, that's wrong. It was later I saw an article, sometime not long after that, I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal, actually. It's that feature column they always have on their front page. And I went and I dredged that article up and looked at who made balloons, and they named 3 people who were doing it. One was a real company, one was Raven, another was Semco, was basically Mark Semich, and another was Picard, which is a pretty minuscule operation at that time. So, there was no internet then, so I wrote to each of these 3 companies. I mean, I tracked down addresses and I wrote to them. Semco sent me a really unimpressive brochure with misspellings and grammatical errors, and said if I got a good agent and and a balloon and learned how to fly it, that I could make a lot of money appearing at county fairs. And Picard never answered. Raven sent a 4-page, really slick color brochure. Now, what I learned later is, well, the year I bought my first balloon, jumping ahead to 1970, was Raven sold 12 balloons in 1970, one of which was my first balloon. In 1968 or so, when this was happening, they were probably selling like 3 or 2 a year. I mean, there was just like nothing going on. But what really caused me to directly get into it was in 1970 in the spring, when the weather was getting nice, we were driving around one evening just to enjoy the nice weather and stumbled on a little fair that had a guy with a helicopter there selling $5 helicopter rides. And we took a little helicopter ride for just 5 minutes over the woods next to this field. And I didn't like being stuck in this tiny little cockpit and with all this noise and vibration. I've never trusted helicopters because they don't seem like they should be able to fly. But when we were flying over the trees, I thought, oh God, what would it be like to be here in a hot air balloon? So then at that time I was gainfully employed. I won't tell you the rest of that story, but I was gainfully employed. Both my wife and I were, so we had enough income. We could consider something like that. And I swung into action and found Denny Floden, and, I had a guy who could train me nearby. Earlier, the nearest guy would have been 600 miles away, east or west. But in 1970, Denny was there, and even though it wasn't super convenient, it worked out. And it turns out he was a great guy to learn from.
So kind of prior to seeing this balloon, had you ever been thralled by flying? You said you talked about the helicopter, which really didn't interest you. Did anything like planes or this and that kind of catch your attention? Or how did, again, balloons are so majestic to see in the air. We've always kind of been that kid that, is at a balloon event. And that's, really how we all got hooked. So how did that kind of come to, hey, I want to do this?
All through my childhood, I dreamt of being able to swim through the air, to be able to just kind of run and jump and swim through the air and so on. And then I eventually did a little airplane flight. I grew up in White Plains, New York, and went out to Westchester Airport, which was pretty minimal then. But the fixed base operator was selling, just a flight around the pattern. And that was the first time I ever flew in anything. And that was really exciting to me. So then when I was in college, I joined the flying club, which is it didn't work in the end because, it was just too much to try to learn to fly airplanes and doing all the other stuff I was doing. But I started learning to fly airplanes there. That was in Boulder, Colorado. So I got 6.5 hours of time logged in a tail dragger, which is also really pretty cool. Just being up in the air is something that, is really important to me. I know that now in retrospect, and I've flown obviously balloons, but I got my airplane pilot's license. But by the time I got it, I was already an experienced balloonist. So why would I want to fly an airplane? Truthfully. So, and then after I moved out to Oregon, where I am now, to be close to my original family, my brother and 2 sisters and my mother was still alive then. Ballooning, I got a balloon here, and this is not a place to fly balloons because there are mountains. And, Michigan's great. The Midwest is great. That's where people can really fly. And it's just a wonderful place to fly. There's lots of landing places. There aren't the horrible things like mountains and so on. So I ended up flying paragliders. I've made over 1,000 paraglider flights, but that just being up in the sky in one thing or another is really important to me. And being old now, I realize that.
See, I feel like ballooning is one of those odd sports that ends up finding you more than you finding it, because it's kind of weird. So in my situation, so I'm originally from, near Battle Creek on the other side of the fort near Galesburg. And my grandparents lived in Dexter, Michigan, which is where Cameron Balloons was. So every time, their house is a mile from the factory. So I always drove by it as a kid, always mesmerized. I'd love to be that pilot. And then, of course, I grew up near Battle Creek. I did that over 4th of July, as a kid. But then I also had a neighbor that, our friends have a balloon and this and that. So I was always around it, but it found me instead of, me coming to it. It's just kind of weird how it works out. I feel like Joey's kind of the same way with, stuff in Howell growing up. It's just kind of weird how ballooning works some ways like that.
Well, it's, in life, I mean, one of my experiences in life that seems to keep recurring is, opportunities present themselves and probably when you least expect them. And you either seize the opportunity or you don't. Some opportunities maybe you really don't want to seize. But I mean, when I saw balloons, I knew I wanted to do that. And I was going to do that one way or another. I didn't know what it, as I wrote in the book, I think early on, I mean, my wife and I, Tucker, had, when we were talking about getting a balloon, thought we'd probably get bored after 50 hours of flying and move on to something else. Well, that didn't happen. but one of the things about, one of the lessons is that when opportunities present themselves, think hard about whether to take it or not, because that may be a gift. And in the case of balloons, it was. I mean, that balloons defined my whole life. Well, after I discovered them, really. And I was just lucky, it's just a lucky occurrence, but I'll take credit for realizing this is something worth doing.
It's so cool, like how long ago you first saw a balloon and like you've been in ballooning for so long. And then how did you get into competition ballooning?
Well, there's a simple answer to that. When I started flying balloons, I mean, you got my training from Denny Floden, who is he's a competitive person. And I got great training from him. He has a completely different personality than I do, but he's very competitive and he's good. He put himself through the University of Michigan on a swimming scholarship. He was a varsity swimmer, and so that's all obviously very competitive. That's, you're not doing that just for fun. You're trying to win always. But he was the guy who trained me, and I went to my first national championship in Indianola. When I was a student pilot in 1970. In fact, I made one flight with Danny, not during the competition, but one flight in Warren County, Iowa. It was really cool. That was my introduction to a place that was going to be pretty important to me. But it just seemed natural to compete. You had a balloon, when nationals time came in the early 70s, you just sign up. There's no qualification. And you'd go and get to do this fun thing. And it was easy in the early days because, as I put it, most of the people there, I don't think were very serious about competing. I didn't know you weren't supposed to try really hard. So the first task of any kind, the first competition of any kind I flew on a balloon was a barograph task in the Nationals in 1971, and I won it hands down. I mean, Matt Whitaker came in second, and he was like more than a minute behind in the time in the boxes. So that was like a big deal. I thought, whoa, maybe I can do that. And then, we didn't do any paid rides or any kind of commercial ballooning. I mean, a lot of people kind of don't realize that because, I'm known as being this kind of, back in the old days anyway, this hotshot competitor, and also, through Cameron Balloons, which is a commercial thing, but that's not ballooning, that's manufacturing balloons. That's a kind of a different world. I've said many times we could just as well have been manufacturing toilets, It still would have been really interesting because that's a whole different thing, is to try to figure out how to set up an efficient process to manufacture something. But what I was trying to say is that what we did is we flew every chance we got. And, I worked for the university, which is kind of a little bit loosey-goosey. And there's a lot of flexibility, but we didn't really even need it so much because once we had daylight savings time in Michigan, which we didn't have for a period, but once we had that, then the earliest sunrise was 6, which is almost tolerable, and then so on weekends you could go out and fly, from 6 to 9 or whatever when the thermals start. And then we could go home after work in like June and July, have dinner, and then we could go out and fly for an hour. and the sunset would be 9:15. The latest, you guys know, the latest sunset's 9:15, and the sky's still light at 10 o'clock. So we flew a lot. I mean, I typically flew, and this is all just for fun and a little bit of competition. I only did the competition and a few spring meets and then the nationals. And then if I was lucky to go to a world championship, but the rest of it was all just fun flying. And I always flew 100 hours a year on that basis. So it was quite a bit for, just flying for fun, and flying for fun involved, well, the area out northwest of us with the lakes, that's a great place to fly balloons because you could, see how many lakes you could land on in one flight. We almost hit 5 once. We had 4. Dave Schaefer and I, each flying our own balloons, each hit 4 lakes and narrowly missed the 5th one evening. And so there's little hills and little bits of forest, and then not so much farming because it's kind of a little bit rugged, but it's a wonderful place to play.
Where did you fly?
In Washtenaw County, northwest of Ann Arbor.
Okay.
It's the area where the Defiance Moraine, which exists, which is where but some, giant masses of ice moved down millions of years ago and gouged out all these lakes, and it made it and built up the little hills. And it made it lousy for farming. So if you fly in that area, if you go up a little in the northwest of you can see lots of farmland, and to the southeast, you see lots of farmland. But then there's this big area, which is these little lakes and swamps and little hills and little woods. And it's a really kind of cool place to fly. And it was right there. I mean, we were able to make a deal with the Clinton Huron Metropolitan Park Authority people. Why they let us do this, I don't know, but they let us fly from Hudson Mills Park, which is at Dexter. And not only did they let us do that, but since the park didn't open until like 7 or 8, they gave us a key. So we let ourselves into the park. I just went out for years, let ourselves in, unlock the gate, drive in, lock the gate again, go, take off, But it was only like 15 minutes from our house. And that's right in, that's right about the southeast edge of the really nice area. Maybe it's a little bit into it, actually. So I think I got good at flying balloons. Well, I got good at flying balloons for maybe 3 reasons. One is Denny gave me really good training. Another is balloon burners at that time were pathetic. You're absolutely pathetic. My first balloon, the first Raven, had on a hot summer day, it would put out like 4 million B2 per hour, like with everything on, which was basically the two little cans. And the balloon I ultimately was flying in balloon competition had 13 times as much burner power, 54 million B2 per hour maximum. I mean, I'd feel the deceleration in my legs when I turned everything on. So I could do some pretty abrupt maneuvers, I guess is the best way to put it. But, and the other thing was about being, getting good at balloon competitions is just had such a beautiful area to fly in, and just flying. I mean, when you fly, you don't just go up and sit there at 1,000 feet. I don't anyway, and cruise along. It was always just coming over the trees and down and doing touch and goes and touching down lakes and all that.
I've always loved the comment. I think it was on the Auntie Monkey podcast that you made about the floaters of the bunch, the tourist. I always love that comment. It's like, what would you say was the tourist and just the guys you knew you were going to have to compete against all week? I always thought that was, it's so true. I mean, there's some guys that go to nationals that, never flown a task before, which is few and far between now in the US, but back in the day, it was pretty common.
I can't claim credit for that. That was Tom Shepard who used to say that. He'd say I can't remember. He said they're competitors and they're the tourists, and most of the people competing in a balloon championship were tourists. Along that line, whenever I went to the nationals or a world championship for that matter, but particularly the nationals, the night before the first task, I would sit and look through the list of the competitors, and in my mind, I would decide who are the people who are actually really going to compete, who are good, and I had to do better than, And that usually that was a group, something like what Tom would have described it, kind of about 10 people. And I mean, it's just the truth. But it kind of helped me to kind of get focused in, Having confidence is really important in competition. I think it's important in any competition. And knowing that there were only like, 10 other people or so that I had to think about, beating me, made it possible to be a lot more confident. And if you're confident, then you kind of make better, I make better decisions anyway. I don't know, I guess probably everyone does if they're confident. You don't go for it, what the hell, maybe it'll work. One thing about balloon competition is you don't ever want to get a really bad score. I mean, you don't want to really screw up. And if things turn against you, if the wind shifts or something strange happens, and you're going to end up getting, the best you're going to do is get like 300 points or something. You got to, in a championship, which is what I was interested in. That's kind of what I cared about. In a championship, you've got to scrape and scrounge for every point you can. So getting 325 is better than getting 300. So that just getting despondent and saying, oh, what the heck, or maybe trying some bizarre thing that has a very small chance of working and might end up giving you 50 points total. It might not be smart.
So you won 6 national championships over a 15-year period. And you said kind of the beginning, there was a lot more tourists than there were competitors. So kind of back towards when you won your last couple, did it get more competitive, I'm assuming, or was it still about the same?
Well, it got more competitive. Now, I haven't competed since 90 something, early 90s, but right. I competed in 18 nationals in Indianola, and I won 6 of those. So I won 1 out of every 3 exactly. And I've thought about that since. And I mean, there's always the woulda, shoulda, coulda stuff and so on. But, for 3 years, I was on the BFA board. 2 of those, I was president of the BFA, and we had all our meetings during the nationals. And I thought about that. I think it was when I was writing my book. I thought, if I hadn't done that and hadn't been, had been able to rest and, be more prepared for flying, I probably would have won another nationals. I mean, given that I won 1 out of every 3 anyway. And then, arguably, if we hadn't started manufacturing balloons, which is a gigantic distraction, I probably would have won another one, I think. I competed 18 years. I thought I was trying to do it. I was doing it seriously, but I had these distractions in these 2 different stages. So I think it would have been possible, and not that it matters really, it might have been possible for me to have won 8 if I just did that, like a lot of other people. I mean, who compete, don't have the big distractions, but
yeah.
But also, to be fair, the only reason I won a lot of nationals, the big reason is I started early, and when nobody knew what they were doing, and I actually focused on it, and then I got momentum, experience and momentum, and it was a lot of fun.
I feel like Joe Zavada kind of hit the same thing, kind of more towards the modern era with the balloon pong stuff of the rest. Again, he was trying to do so much for everyone else and, make videos. Yeah. And he just kind of almost drained you. And he didn't come out and say it cost him a national championship, but it definitely affected him. And again, the same thing with being president and running the magazine. I'm sure it affected you. You're trying to, again, you're trying to compete. You're trying to then work with Cameron. You're trying to be editor, all this stuff. And you're trying to put all these eggs in one basket, but you can only really do one thing at once,
Yeah. No, I don't regret it. I mean, doing the BFA stuff was kind of like being civically responsible, And at that time there was a lot, it was really early and ballooning was in its formative stages and people didn't really know what to do with it. And they didn't even know what a national organization should be doing. And then there was the whole competition thing was got kind of strange for a while because some people didn't think people should compete in balloons. That balloons are these beautiful things that float along, and it's like kind of an insult to the sport to degrade it by turning it into a competition. But oh well, I mean, I even met a guy who a balloonist talking to him at the Nationals one year, who said he thought it was unfair to practice for competition, that it was unethical. So he probably thinks it's unethical for people to practice for the Olympics. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't agree with him.
So how much do you still follow like competition ballooning in the US? You still kind of follow up on like Facebook, or not really at all?
Well, I watch from a distance. I'm really pretty isolated from ballooning now because, as I say, I live in a place where I had a balloon for a while here. I flew it only a few times. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Well, the way I like to put it is, when I sold this balloon, I looked at my logbook, and I knew where I'd taken off and where I'd landed each time I flew. It wasn't very many flights. This was easy to do. And I calculated that I had averaged 1 mile per hour for all of the ballooning I did in Southern Oregon, 1 mile per hour. And so what I like to say is, it's hard to get excited about flying 1 mile an hour for someone who's flown 100 miles an hour in a hot air balloon. I mean, that's basically, that's kind of it in a weird kind of nutshell. So, I mean, you could crawl, you could walk easily, or stroll as a chase for these flights. That's just not my cup of tea.
So of the current competitors, you got a couple guys that are coming on your 6 national championships. Who do you think has the best chance to either tie or pass your championships?
Well, I mean, obviously, how many are there? 3 people have won 6 now, or 5 now? There's Joe and
there's I believe it's 2 that have won 5, and then Johnny Petrin has 4 as well. But Nick Donner and Joe Hartzell.
Yeah. It's tricky because Joe has a gigantic distraction now. I'm sure he wouldn't say that this is the case, but he does, because his son has won the last 2 world championships, right? So where does that leave Joe? I mean, is he going to be driven more by being the proud father has got an incredible record in competition himself? Or is he really going to be fully focused on winning himself? And then Nick, I don't know. When Nick came on the scene, I didn't know him from a load of hay. I've met him I've met him twice now in more recent years, and we've had almost no conversation. But when he started competing and he won a nationals, there were all these people saying, "Oh, he was just won by luck," and blah 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 blah. And I've been around long enough to be able to look at what the tasks were and what the scores were, and how someone's done and so on. And I concluded there's no way this guy won by luck. This guy is good. That was after all I knew about him was the results from 1 national championship. I didn't even know he existed before that. And I told people that. And I guess I was right. He had all the earmarks. But then, I think in any activity that takes a lot of time and effort and money too, really, that it's hard to keep doing it year in and year out and so on, and get the same reward from it. And I think then that can detract from your performance eventually. And I don't know how that works for different people. I mean, I got to the point finally where I was pretty much done. I would have liked to have won another world championship, but I've only won 1. That's a long story that if you read the book, but the Nationals was kind of cool. I mean, the Nationals record.
So, yeah, like you had just mentioned, we also know you won the 1981 World Championships in Battle Creek. Can you tell us a little bit about, that week?
Wow. Well, it yeah, I could tell you a lot about it, really. The first task was crazy. The first task, I think the safety officer wasn't actually there yet. There'd been some delay. And in fact, the safety officer was a good friend of mine, but I think he had some unavoidable delay and he couldn't get there for that by that day. And they ended up running the task anyway. And it was like a 5,000 foot dark overcast. And they sent us out on a 10,000 meter, basically, wait a minute, what was it? Yeah, it was like 10,000 meter fly into the airport from the Southwest. And I mean, it was just kind of a spooky looking day. It was the afternoon and it was solid overcast. It was kind of dark. And by the time I was with Dave Schaefer. I mean, we used to drive out looking for takeoff places together. And we, found a field, got permission, got our balloons inflated. By the time our balloons were inflated, it was pouring rain. This isn't the first time this happened to me, but that was the first time, it wasn't the last time. But and I stood there in the basket and I thought, and I worked really hard to get to this world championship. And I have all these tales of woe before that, like almost winning world championships, like coming in second and, having my balloon rip in Sweden was pretty dramatic, which prevented me from winning, even though I'd been in the lead going to the last flight. And I thought about it and thought, okay, if I deflate now, I've lost the world championship. Like, I'm not going to do that. So I took off and after I took off, I was in pouring rain. I'm moving southwest away from the target of the airport. Thinking, oh, this is really going great. So I climbed literally cloud base, pretty much to cloud base, and found wind that was going back. And this is only 2 miles, but it was very light wind. Climbed to cloud base, still in pouring rain, and crept along. And I was basically going to pass the target on the airport by about maybe 500 feet to the right, maybe 400 feet. I'm at 5,000 feet. So I decided, okay, I've got to I had to stay up high to go that direction. And then I, vented and came plummeting down and made this sharp turn and went past the target and finished, I think it was 8th out of 100. And then Bill Murtaugh said, I went across the airport and landed where they parked those jet fighters over there. And Bill Murtaugh was there. And he said, you want me to grab you? He said, because there's these expensive, super expensive airplanes. And I said, yeah. And when he grabbed the basket, he got this gigantic shock from the static electricity I'd collected, because there were thunderstorms going on. I mean, there's all kinds of static electricity in the air. Some people were hailed on in flight. So that was kind of an exciting start to that world championship. The ending of the world championship was weird, I guess. Yes. And I, on the last day, there was declared a judge-declared goal we took off from the airport. There was a judge-declared goal and then a pilot-declared goal. And I did basically a fairly pathetic job on it. I don't know why, but I just wasn't dialed in, and I missed the judge-declared goal by a lot. And I did probably pretty well in the pilot. I always did well in pilot-declared goals because that's what I practiced when I did practice flying. I do like 3 or 4 an hour, maybe practice like 6 real approaches. Road intersections, you drop markers, and person chasing me would measure it. So if pilot declared goals I could do well on, but then I thought, and I'd been I don't know if I was in second place. I think I was in second place going into that. And I thought, well, I screwed it up. I'm going to finish second or third or fourth, not first again. And then and then we've been required to fly solo. And the other guy is a Canadian, Del Michaud, had been flying with a friend who was a navigator. And it turned out apparently Del didn't really know how to navigate. So when we were required to fly solo, he was lost. And I mean, the end of the story is really kind of dramatic because Tucker and I drove back to Ann Arbor. It's kind of weird going to a world championship that's an hour and a quarter from your home, but drove back to switch balloons to get Humungi and the the crazy two basket thing we were doing. And so we could fly all of my very large crew. Of course, Tucker had to listen to me beating myself up the whole way back to Ann Arbor and then the whole way back to Battle Creek about what I should have done, could have done. Why didn't I do this? I mean, I just gave this championship away. But it turned out that in reality, well, I'll tell the rest of the story the way it is. We got to the airport and we got there late for the afternoon briefing, which didn't really matter to me, but I mean, it didn't matter a lot. But when I got to the hangar where the briefing was being held, just as I approached the door in the front, which is where my seat was, right in the front corner, Tom Shepard and probably Debbie Spaeth was with him, I don't remember, walked out. And someone before that, as I was walking from the car, there's almost no one there, but a spectator congratulated me. I hate getting congratulated for finishing fourth or eighth or ninth or whatever. So, but I was polite. And after the second person congratulated me, I said, "What are you congratulating me for?" And the person looked at me like I was crazy. I said, "Well, for winning the world championship." Then I ran to the door and Tom and Debbie came out and I said, "Is it true?" And Tom has a big smile on his face. Yep. So that was kind of cool.
So I think one of the most iconic pictures in ballooning came from that moment too, with your buddy Christian Amundan picking you up and carrying you down to the front and center stage right after you found out.
No, that was at the banquet.
Oh, gotcha.
That was at the banquet and it was in a hangar. I don't know, the hangar on the other side of the airport, I think, but it was where the banquet was. And I didn't know he was going to do that. He later told me he could, Christian's very strong, but he has no endurance. He said he almost wasn't able to carry me all the way. He just grabbed me and picked me up. What could I do? It's a great photo. I think it was on the front of the Battle Creek Inquirer. I mean, it had to be. It was a great photo.
So you also wrote a book called A Life in the Air. So what made you decide to write that book about your ballooning career?
Well, I'd never written a book, so I thought that might be interesting. And, partly it's because when I moved out to Oregon, with the exception of having a balloon for a couple of years here and hardly flying it because of the mountains and all that, I got much more isolated from ballooning. So my real ballooning career is the 70s, the 80s, and basically half of the 90s. And then I did other ballooning after mid 90s. It was basically 25 years. And then I did some other stuff. I did a lot of stuff that I could only do because I was out of Cameron Balloons, and I didn't have to run a company. And so I got to do the round the world stuff I did, which is pretty cool. In fact, I have sitting right to my left here, I have a more or less copy of the round the world autopilots that I made that both Steve Fawcett and Fedor Konyakov used in their successful solo nonstop balloon flights around the world. And I'm just building another one for Bill Smith, who's going to try to set AX8 distance record. I think he's going to try to fly 1,200 miles. It's pretty hard because of the daylight problem. But, the reason I mentioned daylight is that what's really critical to his flight is to have have bright sunshine for the heat. And in the night part, you get beat up on fuel consumption. You use a lot more fuel at night, especially if you're flying high. And you have to fly high if you want to go 1,200 miles in a hot air balloon. I mean, in a 105,000 cubic foot hot air balloon. Anyway, it's a fun, I call it my COVID-19 project. I tried to do it a different way than I did last time. And I spent probably 8 months beating my head against the wall and shipping prototype autopilots to Bill in Kentucky, having him flight test it and send me videos and stuff and data, and then I'd do modifications and go back and forth, and finally concluded that the only way you can do it is to use a ball, preferably model 400 variometer, which they quit making in 1988. And no one makes variometers like using that same mechanism anymore, because it's really easy to make a variometer with one of these really good digital pressure transducers that cost like $10. But you can't get the next step, which is acceleration, from that, because they're too the data is too wobbly, and all the wobbliness shows up as acceleration, but it's not. So, oh well. But I couldn't stop. I thought, damn it, I'm going to build a functional variometer, even if I have to do it the way I did 25 years ago. So I put the word out. Some of you may have seen it on Facebook. And within a day, I had like 3 different people offering ball model 400 variometers. They had sitting collecting dust on a shelf in the back room. So anyway, I'm glad that project's almost over, because it's been taking a lot of time.
So you've certainly done a lot in your ballooning career. Is there anything on your bucket list that you didn't get to achieve in ballooning?
I don't know. I like to say all my family has the gratitude gene, so we're just happy with the things we got to do in life. And I mean, yeah, as I said earlier, I would have liked to have won a second world championship. Who was it? I read an interview once years ago about Parnelli Jones, I never heard of, but he was a great auto racer, and he won a national championship. And someone interviewed him after that, and he said, well, what are your goals now? He said, well, to win another one, to prove the first one wasn't a fluke. And that's all stuck in my mind. Now, I did that in the nationals, but I didn't do that in the world. I came close, but no cigar. I finished first, second, third, fourth, 6th, and 7th in world championships. I actually, to be fair, in Battle Creek in '85, when we were building our factory, I finished like 21st. but that's my entire world championship record. So it's basically eliminating the building the factory one. They're all in the top 7. But it would have been nice if maybe the second place one could have. If I would have turned all the ones from second down in for one more win if I could have. But I don't lose sleep over this.
So the last thing we're going to go into is, I don't know how familiar you are with the show, but each week we have a group of about 5 questions that we ask each guest, and then we go into our fan questions as well. Cool. So we're just going to start shooting those at you. So our first one comes from fellow pilot Blake Aldridge. We ask this to every single guest. Do you have a favorite Marvel movie, like Marvel Comics?
No.
Did you ever have like a favorite post-flight meal?
Oh, wow. Probably, because in mornings, weekend mornings, which usually involved like Dave Schaefer, and we had 2 balloons. So maybe Tucker was flying one and I was flying one, and maybe David was flying his, and so on. We'd very often go out to breakfast, but I can't remember what it would be. So I don't know. I don't remember that. It obviously wasn't a super important thing.
Back when you were still flying at events, much like professional athletes, if you got to choose a song to, like when athletes go out onto the court or go out onto the field, If you got one of those walk-up songs at an event, what do you think you would have chosen?
Well, I had two songs that were important. One was, God, who was it? You know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Can't remember the guy who sang that. And the other one was the theme. Yeah, the other one was the theme from Rocky. I actually played that once, and I had a tape of it, and I played it before a flight in nationals. Didn't help, but.
If you could have lunch with any other ballooning legend, past or present, who would it be and why?
I've had lunch with a lot of ballooning legends. So let's see, ones I haven't had lunch with. It probably would be Nick Donner. Because as I said, I've met him twice. And I mean, Joe Hartzell introduced me to Nick in Japan once when I was on an international jury at an event there. But they were, there was a big group of people and all that. It just wasn't a time we could talk. And so I didn't get to talk to him there. And then in Reno, I kind of ran into him at some point, it was the same kind of situation where there wasn't time, because of other things that were going on. So I think Nick would be the one.
What was the first ever balloon event you flew as a pilot?
It probably was in Valparaiso, Indiana. It wasn't much. It was a gathering, and people had balloons there. And I don't know that we even really actually free flew because it was really foggy. But we inflated balloons. In fact, I'm not even sure we did. But one of the very, very, very early on, we had a balloon meet in Ann Arbor, in the Ann Arbor Rally. And that would have been 70, summer 72. So that would have been 2 years in. So obviously I went to other balloon meets. I went to the Nationals in 71. I competed in the Nationals in 71. So I don't know. Events were kind of loosey-goosey then. So it's really hard to remember, okay, was this really an event or not? When we went out to flying weekends, they were like events because there'd be typically 3 or maybe 4 balloons, eventually maybe 4, early on 2 or 3.
So we know you didn't really get a chance to compete in the era with, the racers and the new competition balloons. Have you ever had the chance to take one for a spin?
Nope. I kicked myself for having not. I could have designed one easily enough. I've designed balloon envelopes, and I don't know why I didn't do that. So, balloon competition now is completely different than it was when I started, and even when I was even towards the end of my competition, because there were no flight loggers. When I was competing in the early 90s, we were still doing, we're doing the regular task to places, pilot declared goals, judge declared goals, elbows. I was a master at the elbow because I figured out the geometry of how to do it. It isn't obvious, but it is once you know. The way you fly an elbow task is you find 3 different winds, not 2. And typically officials set elbow tasks on days when it's possible to do this. When it's really easy, basically. So you fly the first leg, which is normally the long one. You just set the first line, somewhere. And then you need 2 different winds, one that gets you kind of backish, and then, like more than 90 degrees, like a lot more than 90 degrees probably. And then another one that gets you back to the line from there. When I won my greatest elbow ever probably was in Indianola, which won me a nationals. And that I was tied. This is really a cool story. I was tied with a guy for first place. What are the chances of that? And I knew if we tied in the elbow event was the last event of that nationals. And I knew if we tied, I would win the nationals because the tiebreaker was who had the smallest score difference between his best and his worst score. And I knew I had the smallest difference. So all I had to do was to fly 180-degree elbow and I'd won the nationals. So Phil Hibbard was his name, from Texas. He took off before I did. Part of the reason was that I was fiddling around putting a fifth tank into my little basket, a fifth 10-gallon tank, because I thought, it's really good to be able to fly a long time at an event like this. But it was really disheartening to see as he started flying northeast from the field in Indianola on Symphony College campus. You could see that the wind was shifting over the next few minutes. And I realized I was screwed because he got the use of that wind to the northeast, and I was going to go northeast. So immediately, because I knew or believed that what everyone was going to do is go south then, go up high and go south. And he was going to have a smaller angle, and I was screwed. So I flew the 3 miles. I was over a cornfield. I had the marker in my hand to drop it to establish the end of the first line. And I thought, if I drop the marker, I lose the nationals. I thought, why would I do that? So I put it back on the top of a tank and then started flying around the sky looking for what was going on. And ended up straight east then, quite a long time later. And this is the rules were weird then. They let you land. They actually let you land and you could hand the marker to your official. This is 77, I think, to observer. And so I did that and said, here's my marker. I'm declaring this at the end of my first line. And then sat there for a couple of minutes, and the balloon got a little bit cool, but then it started leaning. I needed to go straight west to go back towards the launch field. And the balloon just started leaning towards the left. I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. Is this real? And I had to fly a mile. So I took off at about 20 feet above the ground while I was drawing a line on my map, drawing the line back to from where I declared, where I landed there, back to where I'd taken off originally. I was keeping the balloon about 20 feet above the ground and just going straight down this line. I ended up in the middle of nowhere, in a clearing in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. And I used triangulating on barns and stuff that were on the map to make sure I'd gone a mile, and I just plopped down the clearing. That was a really weird experience because as you know, you've probably seen the 1972 video clip of my bizarre rip out landing at a target, which is the first time I won the nationals. But this time there was not a soul around. And as soon as I touched the ground, I knew I'd won the nationals. And there I was all alone. And then my crew had to fight their way through the woods to go and find me. And we didn't carry the balloon out. I kept it inflated and invited the observer to get in. I sat on top of the tanks and we flew out to the first decent field and landed. So I had those two experiences. One was literally to have the other competitors. I mean, because they were what they called contest landings, where you actually had to land the balloon to make your spot. And they're there, they're all there watching, and immediately came up to me afterwards. So that was the one experience. And then I have the experience of being all alone. That was kind of an interesting contrast.
So that is all we have for you on BurnerCast this week. Bruce's book, A Life in the Air, is available on Amazon, Kindle, Audible, and www.alifeintheair.com. Those who want a personalized message inscribed in the book by Bruce himself, order it through the website, and at the same time, send your request for that via the website's email page. Bruce, thank you again so much for joining us, and we will see you next time on BurnerCast.
Great. It's been a great treat.